So we're going to take you now to the next session that has started. It's called Innovative Entrepreneurial Nexus of the Automotive Industry.
No tax credits, no loans. That business is profitable. It stands on its own 2 feet. And I say 2 feet because, rather than a platform or concrete, because really it's just been me and a lot of other passionate people who've just wanted to make a difference. So I think that I'm just one of many examples, and this is just one project of many that proves that we can both make a difference here in Detroit and make a profit. We don't have to choose. So over the last year, I've been pretty busy, like the rest of you. My agency has been focused on smart mobility. Now, the reason I decided to focus on smart mobility is because I believe it's the future of Detroit. Through my agency, I've worked with startups throughout the world. One of them is Automotive, based in Miami, who are really revolutionizing the way that people search for and buy cars online. They are only a few months old, and if I can use my Detroit seduction, I will entice them to establish their headquarters here in Detroit. I've also worked with major global multi-billion-dollar companies, and I'm still working with those companies such as BP and Castrol Motor Oil. Now, I've been working with those companies in the area of smart mobility, and a lot of people ask me, what is an oil company working on smart mobility for? Surely they want just people to drive more, use more oil, use more gas. Well, BP and Castrol see a future where there are a variety of different scenarios, and some of those scenarios mean that people choose other mobility options, other ways to get from point A to point B. They see a future where we have got so good at building fantastic cars and all the products that go in them, including motor oil and gasoline, that potentially there's less need for those products. And in fact, maybe there's no need for oil at all, as we've seen through other innovations in the automotive space. So in order to stay competitive, before it becomes a problem, BP and Castrol Motor Oil have decided that smart mobility needs to be a source of future revenue, a source of future profit. So I went into those companies because they asked me to. So I was living over at the Fort Shelby downtown, and they said, you know, Angel, we really need your help. And I wanted to stay here, but I thought it was a fantastic opportunity to work on some amazing projects, but also to be able to help invest back in Detroit. So as a part of this focus on smart mobility, which I really kind of broadly include any new technology that is transforming the way people get from point to point, or new business models that use existing technologies that help people get from point A to point B. Now, as part of that work, I evaluated, just in this last year, over 200 different startups from all over the world: China, Tel Aviv, Silicon Valley, New York, etc. Of those 200, we invested in 20 new startups and created and incubated 6 new ventures. This is in 1 year. Of those 20 startups, there were companies like Zuby, based in Charleston, South Carolina, a consumer telematics business where you plug in an OBD device and it can convert a 1997 used vehicle into a new connected car in terms of capabilities and applications. Or RepairPal, based in Silicon Valley, who are really transforming the transparency and trust that people have in auto repair and maintenance online. Or Peloton, which is a truck platooning technology company which gives massive, massive fuel efficiencies for fleets. Those are just some of the companies. One of the things I found most shocking in all of these conversations I was having throughout the world, VCs, angel investors, other strategic investors, other major corporations, entrepreneurs from all over, of those 200, I was not introduced to, nor did I discover, a single smart mobility startup in the state of Michigan. Not a single smart mobility business, entrepreneur in the city of Detroit. The place that I believe gave the entire world mobility. That doesn't mean these companies don't exist. That doesn't mean that there aren't amazing, talented entrepreneurs in the space, in the state or in the city, but I really struggled, and I'm still struggling, to find them. And I have a few reasons why I think that's the case. But more than focusing on why have we got to that stage where we are focused on a very narrow model of automotive or mobility, I'd like to instead talk to you about a vision that I have for economic growth in the city and in the region. I call it Silicon Garage. It's the economic engine where entrepreneurs, automotive manufacturers, and policy makers unite and ignite growth. Silicon Garage is based on a premise of taking great ideas, combining them with policies and programs that provide the infrastructure and systems we need to build new businesses, to build new economic growth. I think when I look around at most of the people that are attending the conference, and every day when I'm in the city and I'm in other parts of the state for meetings, I am just astounded by the abundance of talent that we have here. We have extraordinary engineering talent. Every city in the world is looking for the talent that we have right here. We have extraordinary creative talent. We have a history of having engineering and creative talent, and it's still here and thriving today. Unfortunately, many other cities, states, and countries are poaching that talent. They're providing them with opportunities, and some of them are leaving, like I once did. And hopefully, we will create these new businesses so that we can entice the people that have left, I call them the Detroit diaspora, to come back, like I have. I think if we're going to talk about reinventing the city or reinventing the region, then we have to talk about redefining automotive. We have to not only think about automotive as building cars, we have to think about this broader context and this bigger opportunity of smart mobility. And it's my dream that we become a national hub for smart mobility. If I could have it my way, we would be the worldwide hub for smart mobility. And I don't think that's too bold, given the resources that we have here. I think we need to identify, like I've been struggling to over the past year, and it's really early stages, so it's not too late. Support, invest in local entrepreneurs, attract back the Detroit diaspora, and attract new foreign startups. And we have to be very clear about what we offer. I think we need to expand this notion that we've worked with for a long time, because we do have a lot of private businesses here. We do have a lot of small businesses here that work in the automotive space, right? But right now, what I see is a beginning and an end. It's called a value chain. And the value chain is about automotive manufacturers and suppliers. There's an end. Both sides, there's an end. What I think we need to create is a very comprehensive smart mobility ecosystem where each part, including government, city, state, and federal, including startups, entrepreneurs, education, big business, come together with some very specific projects that will attract and astound the rest of the world. And I've got a few of those ideas, so I'm happy to talk about those. There's a quote which is often attributed to one of our most famous entrepreneurs, what I would say our first smart mobility entrepreneur, Henry Ford. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But it's particularly relevant here, isn't it, right? So we got, I don't know, mine was slow, but. Although cars are most people's second most valuable asset, many people value their mobile phones more than they value their cars. Over 65% of 18 to 35-year-olds say if they were forced to choose, they would choose their mobile phone over their cars. 65%. Many of these consumers no longer want the responsibility and the costs involved with owning and maintaining these vehicles. Often these people are choosing car sharing. So a company like Zipcar, to access cars when they need them rather than owning them. Some people see cars that they own as depreciating assets. So they work with startups like Relay Rides, to rent out their own vehicles to complete strangers. It sounds crazy, but it's happening, and these companies are growing very, very fast. Global car sharing is set to grow 26 million members by 2020. And Zipcar alone, and there are many of these companies, removes 15 personally owned cars from the highway every day. There are smart mobility startups like Uber. Uber is a smartphone application that gets you the taxi that's closest to you at that particular moment in time. Yesterday, they announced their valuation is somewhere between 10 billion and 17 billion, and this is a toddler. This is a company that's a few years old. None of these businesses that I've just mentioned, and I've got a very long list, were invented here, in the city, in the region that brought the rest of the world mobility. I believe this vision of the Silicon Garage provides a platform. It's a platform where Detroit doesn't just hustle harder, we hustle smarter. We build billion-dollar companies. I'm sick and tired of being practical, people. I've had so many pragmatic conversations, it's, a bit stifling at times. It's time to think really big. It's time to get our confidence back. I would say that we need to think about bringing sexy back. I think connected car is bringing sexy back to automotive. Driverless cars have inspired the imagination of millions. Of course, most people outside of Michigan don't realize that Google's driverless car is actually being built here. So not only do we need to get more confident, we need to get louder about our success. I believe connected cars will only work when we have connected communities, and that's facilitated by everyone in here who endorses and devises policies for urban infrastructure and the Internet of Things across the region. So if connected cars and Silicon Garage can bring sexy back to Detroit, then I think it's time for the Motor City to allure talent, risk takers, investors, innovators to the Silicon Garage, the economic engine where entrepreneurs, automotive manufacturers, and policymakers unite to ignite growth in Detroit and the region. Thank you.
Please welcome Global Consumer Trends and Futuring Manager at Ford Motor Company, Cheryl Conley, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, Mike Finney, Chief Executive Officer of TruckSmart Parking Services Incorporated, Rick Warner, and moderator Sandy Barua, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Regional Chamber.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank our friends at PwC for sponsoring this. Great opening, Angel. Thank you so much. But I want to start with you, Cheryl. So you're a futurist, right? Now, first of all, I think a lot of folks are going to be surprised that a company like Ford Motor Company employs someone who has a title of futurist. But I assume that most of us would think that a company like Ford does a couple focus groups, decides based on those focus groups what consumers want 5, 10 years from now, and assigns that task to a bunch of engineers in some Ford basement. Tell us how it really works in today's automotive industry.
Well, so Sandy, you're right. I think a lot of people think that those things are run by focus groups. And we just heard Angel refer to Henry Ford's famous quote, if I had asked consumers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And therein lies a problem that we still as a company have. We have a 3-year development cycle with an extraordinary capital investment. So we have to try to get ahead of the curve and try to understand what innovations will resonate. And we have to be careful that these are innovations that consumers want. So my job is to track global trends, to understand social, technological, economic forces that will shape consumer values, attitudes, and behaviors. And so that's where the work comes in. So I can look anywhere from 5 years out to 50 years out.
So what's a trend that, give us an example of what you think is a global trend or that you've identified in the past that has affected a Ford product?
So from Trend 101, we always look at the demographics. So aging population on a world stage is one of the most significant challenges that all of us will face in our collective lifetimes. It's estimated that the first person to live to be 150 years of age has already been born. So that could be someone in this room. And the consequences of those are so dramatic. The first of which is, can we support ourselves? I mean, the pension was created to support someone 2 to 3 years after they retired, and now you're asking it to support 2 to 3 decades after they retire it. So we have to think about those things in terms of where are market opportunities. But more fundamentally, we know the physiological changes of aging, like reduced response time, impaired vision, limited range of motion. We have to design and engineer for that. And so those are shaping the vehicles you see on the road today. That's why we have a camera that shows you what's behind the vehicle, so you don't have to turn your head. But we want to make sure we do it in a way that it resonates, whether you're 17 or 71.
Okay, cool. So, Mike, Cheryl talked about, how companies like Ford are, looking at the future and how that is impacting innovation. Angel obviously talked about a lot of startup companies. How is the state of Michigan poised to kind of attract these entrepreneurs and these innovators who are kind of making these kinds of technologies happen?
So Michigan has a history of actually cultivating entrepreneurs, and that history goes back, and I guess we can continue with the Henry Ford theme. But there's also been other great entrepreneurs of that same era, people like W.K. Kellogg and Charles Stewart Mott and so many other phenomenal entrepreneurs. And then there was this period in time where Michigan's success, we lost that entrepreneurial mojo. But if you look at today, and you think about some of the great companies that have been formed, companies like Barracuda Networks, Groupon, Google for that matter, they all have a Michigan pedigree in terms of the leaders of those companies, the founders of those companies. And the challenge, of course, is getting them to stay and grow those companies here in Michigan. So what we have to do and what we think is important for us is to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem that makes it highly likely that not only can they start their companies here and develop their innovations here, but they can actually grow the companies here. And so we've spent a lot of our time and effort figuring out how to build that ecosystem out to support virtually every aspect of an entrepreneur's needs. And we think that will then translate into those entrepreneurs staying and growing companies here in Michigan. The other thing that we think is really important is what our universities have been doing. I think President Mary Sue Coleman yesterday presented some data in terms of what the University Research Corridor is doing. I mean, that's a pipeline of innovation and talent that we think makes absolute perfect sense for us to engage with. So we've also engaged in a very aggressive way with our universities to ensure that all those wonderful innovations and the faculty, staff, and students associated with it are getting connected in with the programs that we have here in our state so that they decide to grow their businesses here. So we think it's all about connectedness. We think that the state we've done a lot over the past few years. We still have a long way to go, but we're continuing to invest in an aggressive way in building out the ecosystem to support entrepreneurs.
So tell us more about the ecosystem. A lot of folks think it's, okay, access to capital, access to capital. You hear that a lot. What are the other parts of the ecosystem that entrepreneurs need to flourish?
Yeah, money is always the first thing. I can't tell you how many people walk in my office and the first thing they want us to do is write them a check. And it's this idea that money is free and it's easy to get. The reality is you typically need to make sure that you've really developed your idea to the point of commercialization if you're going to actually go and try and raise money. So we like to talk about talent and the importance of having the right talent in place. It's fairly rare that I meet an entrepreneur who is really the right person to take that company to the next stage. So trying to get the right senior level talent in place, finding the right advisors and board members that can help guide a company strategically, identifying who the right customers are and finding ways to get access to those customers. Of course, finding the money that it's going to take to grow, and then finding facilities that can incubate a company and provide very high quality services. We call that business acceleration. I mean, those are just some of the elements that we're working on building here in the state of Michigan so that companies have the highest probability of success. The reality is we don't see nearly as much activity, as Angel pointed out, in the manufacturing space and in the automotive space in particular, as we see in some other sectors. IT, software, biotech, life sciences. We actually see and have seen a lot of activity in those areas. Ironically, we haven't seen nearly as much in the automotive space. And so this year, or I guess it would be late last year for the first time, Governor Snyder put in place an automotive office to really provide very strategic leadership in the automotive space so that we start to not only go after and mine large established companies, but we start looking for those entrepreneurial ventures as well that's coming out of the auto research environs and getting those into the hands of aspiring entrepreneurs that want to grow them and do well here in the state of Michigan.
Okay. So, Rick, in Angel's opening, she said that she was having a really difficult time finding Michigan-based entrepreneurs in this new next-generation mobility space.
Yeah.
You're one of them. And Angel, meet Rick, Rick, meet Angel. But tell us your story. I mean, you, because you had, you're from Michigan, but your company had some California roots, but now you're back as a Michigander. Tell us your story.
Yeah, well, Truck Smart Parking Services is an information network. It's a service provider to solve an impending crisis for long-haul truckers. We're all talking about, Ford's concern about everybody being worried about these versus buying a car in the next generation. And so moving those goods is important to our national economy. Well, when I was in California working on smart parking in general in an urban space, we realized that there's a very powerful B2B opportunity here instead of a B2B, B2consumer play. And what I saw in Michigan is leadership at MEDC's level and at MDOT's level that understood private-public partnerships, understood practical innovation. Like the presentation by Jim yesterday, I thought was right on the mark. You can innovate and change, but you got to tie it to a consumer adoption. And frankly, there's been so much success without revenue in the .com successes, the Google successes, all wonderful, great valuation opportunities, but they aren't pure revenue-driven businesses in a B2B realm. And I really saw that Michigan had that competency to do that and the leadership to help it. And quite frankly, we're going to be launching Truck Smart Parking Services with the help of MDOT, private money, public money. And we're going to push that, I like to say, made from Michigan and take it out to the nation and provide a service to the rest of the country. So that's my story and why be in Michigan. That's the reason.
And did you find your capital in Michigan? Did you have to go outside of Michigan to find your capital? How did that work?
Well, it's interesting. We were too early for smart parking, so I couldn't get anybody in California to give a hoot about smart parking. We got other things to build. We got to build another Google. We don't want to worry about parking. Whereas here in Michigan, they actually saw it. Spark, Skip Sims, Paula, Mike, and others. So we really plowed a lot of with bleeding edge, and we weren't that successful, frankly, as a business on that front. But there are other ones that are fostering, and we found the pivot point through continued cooperation.
Well, and Sandy, capital is one of the big things. I briefly talked about it. The reality is, back when Michigan was first starting to really focus in on entrepreneurial activity, we had very limited opportunities for access to capital. It was primarily friends and family, and you were awfully lucky if you could get friends and family to make an investment in your startup. Now, we have billions of dollars in venture capital available through a network of 30-plus venture capitalists who are operating in our state. You go back, 13, 14 years ago when the state was just starting to get active, there were a handful, I think 2 or 3 with a few $100 million of capital available to them. I mean, that's a very big step forward. So when companies like, Angels come forward, or Rick's, or others that we've dealt with, when those companies come forward looking for the capital they need, there's definitely an option for them. But it also is an opportunity for us to then introduce them to the entire ecosystem that's there to support them, including getting access to major customers like a Ford and others who are actively looking for new opportunities through programs like Pure Michigan Business Connect that we operate. So it really is a very different environment now than it was several years ago when Rick and others were just getting started.
Well, when you look at Michigan's entrepreneurial index standing, it has gone from essentially the bottom to top 10. Right. Just in a very short period of time. I think that's remarkable.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest indicators of the progress that we've made. And I was one of those folks when a few years back when I first returned to Michigan that did not appreciate the SBAM annual entrepreneurial index and survey because Michigan was hit extremely hard. The reality is that we've done what's been necessary. We've taken the medicine, we've done what's been necessary to move us from being a bottom tier state to being a top tier state, and we just have to make sure we continue to focus on it.
So I agree that I think it's a heck of a lot better now than when I was starting up, one of my first businesses, and I've had a few, and I've floated some of them on the stock market and had big trade sales, and I never even attempted early on to raise capital here. And I think entrepreneurs here do feel like they have access and are aware of more sources of capital. But I still think, for example, the culture of angel investment or the culture of individuals investing, usually what is considered small amounts, $25,000 into a new venture is still pretty, limited. Like, I'll do a brief poll. How many people in here have actually invested their own personal money into a startup? Okay, this is amazing. That's why you're here, right? Now, when I was preparing for today, I sent an email to my corporate accountant in the UK, and I sent one to my accountant here. And I said, can you please succinctly, outline what the tax incentives, advantages, or policies are around angel investments, because I can't remember. Luckily, most of my investments have been good. One just went bankrupt last year, though. And I did the same here. My accountant in the UK gave me a super clear 6-point email, which made it very easy for me to do the math based on this, bankruptcy of this startup that was in 5 years in business, very successful, and then another company came in and disrupted the model. I asked the same question to my accountant here, and I got almost 5 pages of, tax language, and I've got a master's and in law and a JD, and I was overwhelmed. And so I think, we need to be much clearer about angel investment, and we need to, I think, find different ways to support people who would like to invest in their nephew or their neighbor as opposed to, the stock market or whatever. So I do think it's a heck of a lot better here now, but particularly when it comes to that friends and family investment, the angel investment, it sounds like, it looks like we've got a lot of smart people in here, but we really need to extend that more widely so that people feel more confident about taking their own personal money and investing it. I think it's great because, at least you can go knock on the door. You can't do that on the stock market as easily. Yeah.
Angel, I'd layer on that a little bit, that it's good that we have the angel investment structure and there is money around. But part of it is, if we really want to make a mark nationally, it's moving to sources of larger capital. Like once we get beyond the $1 million, $2 million, we got to have some resources behind that. But to actually back Mike's perspective up, I think the best thing that we can continue to do that has been really helpful for smart parking is access to the buyers, access to clients, customers. So we spend time determining the real value propositions of the practical innovation. And continuing to focus on that and leverage that competency, I think we can push it out from the state. So it's drive revenue. And it's funny because it becomes it's a blessing and a curse. The angels want to see that traction versus, out in California, you don't, here's a piece of paper and a good idea. It's not that, the way it was, but it's a little bit different. But it is it's an asset that we can continue to leverage, I think.
If I could just stick with Rick just for 1 second. Can you say something about the importance of failure? When we had breakfast this morning, you talked about the importance of failure.
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings is fail fast.
Oh, sure.
And it's hard for us to do here. It is one of the things we really, and I, back to the other addresses in Rick Snyder's presentation, get out there and aggressively break it. Because when you do that, you learn what's really valuable. And so, believe me, I've had my failures, and I know where I've made my mistakes, and I know the outside factors that affected those, but, that's life. And especially in the venture game, you're not going to win every time. So, and the innovation around practical ideas and applying that appropriately, again, I don't want to even say it, I won't say it, but fail fast. And
You know, Sandy, this concept of failing fast, I think we get caught up on the term failing, right?
Yeah.
And it's a good thing this is not the education panel, discussing failing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it really doesn't make sense. I like to talk about just entrepreneurial risk-taking. I've spent a lot of time, working on what is it that successful entrepreneurs are able to do. And instead of talking about failing fast, we talk about entrepreneurial risk-taking. And in risk, there's a whole bunch of things, including that your innovation won't work, that your customers won't come through. I mean, there's a lot to that. And when you talk about it in that context, investors typically get it. And so then it's not so much that they are funding a failure as much as they are funding a reasonable risk. And so it's about risk-taking. And failure in terms of financial success or the product success is a part of that.
Yeah, and I think
Sure.
failure is also really important because you never get it right the first time. If you do, you're usually a one-hit wonder, and hopefully you've made it big enough that you never have to worry about it again. But the reason failure is so important and taking those risks are so important is because you constantly have to iterate. The product isn't going to be quite right for right out of the door. The service isn't going to be quite right until you actually have customers. So, and a lot of times your customers or your partners are helping you constantly iterate and refine what your business model is. I've gone into certain businesses thinking that my revenue is going to come from one source and finding out that it actually came from an entirely different source. And it became a really successful business, but it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be when I first started. So that was a failure because I went into it with an intention that was not successful. However, I ended up building a very, very successful business through that failure and learning that I needed to look elsewhere and I needed to tweak it in order for it to scale with velocity.
Actually, if I get to go to Cheryl, please.
So I just think that the iterative process is a really critical part, and we do a lot of that within Ford. One of the things I haven't heard discussed in this platform yet was kind of looking outside of the things that you can control or influence. I think failure blindsides us oftentimes because we anticipate something that we didn't put into our plan. I mean, getting from point A to point B is the relatively easy part. The real challenge is anticipating the environment in which you have to execute your plan. So one of the things that we do within Ford is that our discussions don't start in terms of automotive. In fact, it surprises most people to learn that I never look at cars. I don't look at the automotive industry. And so my job is to look at big picture global shifts and try to understand how those work together. And only after we fully explore that do we even talk about, well, what could that mean for the marketplace? What happens to supply, demand, the supply chain, natural resources, cash flow? And only after that do we even ask the question, how would Ford fare in that situation? So when you're developing these scenarios, you develop a scenario that would put extreme strain on your resources, maybe a story of global economic collapse, but then you also develop a story of global economic prosperity to try to do this iterative process to test and see where will you fail, where will you succeed, and hopefully you find enough commonalities in both ends of the spectrum that you don't need to know the future, you just know that your plan is robust enough to weather what comes your way.
So we have time for just one last comment, and I'm going to actually give it to you, Cheryl. One of the things we talked about in our joint breakfast this morning is how the car is no longer the aspirational vehicle it was, well, when Mike and I were growing up. So how does that impact the industry? What are some of the key trends that you have to deal with when kids today aren't looking at cars the way I did when I was growing up?
Indeed, it's different. It's different for every generation. You think about the baby boomers who created the modern day car culture. They look at cars as the quintessential status symbol. But as we've heard from other panelists today, a younger person, a millennial, someone under 30, will say my phone is a much more critical piece. And so Ford's strategy has been to try to tie those things together so that the car does more than just transport you from point A to point B. And we do it in a way that's in keeping with Henry Ford's background about doing it in a way that's democratized, so that's affordable. In 2007, we launched something called the Ford Sync, which was Bluetooth technology that pairs your phone to your entertainment system. We weren't the first to invent it. It was available on luxury and premium goods, but we were the first to offer it on an entry-level vehicle for a mere $300. But since I do have the last point, I would like to say, if we're going to talk about innovation, entrepreneurship within Ford, you have to have a structure to underlie that. And one of the things that will be critical going forward is to look at things like Proposition 1, which will go up to vote in August. Because right now, the taxation that is placed on the resources, the tooling that you bring in to try to make your business cutting edge and leading and innovative is one of the barriers that we have to overcome in order to make this, a more aggressive place to do business.
And I think we all agree on that.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. The personal property tax has nothing to do with personal property, so absolutely. Rick, Angel, Mike, Cheryl, thank you so very much for a great panel. Thank you for being here. Thank you all very much.